I'm going to turn it over to
There is no doubt that tonight is going to be very interesting, and one of the reasons why I said it's going to be very interesting is that one of our friends who came here tonight said, you know, why are you using the topic re-colonization of Africa? Was there a time Africa was ever decolonized? That's a very, very important question. So I would take Mr. Firoze first, who will, of course, talk about, you know, what is being recolonized in this never decolonized Africa. He is, of course, the publisher of Pambazuka News, and that's where you can find some of the most interesting opinions and analysis about what is happening on the continent of Africa. And so, Mr. Firoze, Firoze Manji, you take it away.
I think the starting point is to say, to acknowledge what has been happening over these last few weeks. Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Djibouti, Bahrain, Gabon, to some extent in Cameroon, what is happening on the streets of Kenya, what's happening in South Africa, and so on. What we are witnessing is probably one of the most exciting periods in our history. And it is the rise of discontent across the continent. And there are parallels, because in the 1950s, and I'm looking around the room, rather few of you were around at the time, there was also this extraordinary sweep which covered every single country on the continent. The rise of movements against all forms of oppression and exploitation. And these were movements which were captured by, the imagination was captured by the nationalist movement, which said to them, by supporting us, we will deliver on all your ambitions, all your aspirations. And they were swept into power in the 60s and 70s. The South Africans, as always, were late for the show, didn't come in until 1994. But the same story has to be told. First of all, in that process, it should not be forgotten that there were some serious and really important and impressive gains which we made out of that process. Yes, there were despotic governments. Yes, there was a period where these governments said that they will resist any centrifugal forces. Yes, there were situations where they insisted that trade union movements, women's movements, farmers' movements become incorporated into the ruling party, and that they said that they would deliver on development, they would develop on freedom. But they did achieve very, very significant changes in things like life expectancy at birth, child mortality rates, infant mortality rates, maternal mortality rates. All of these had, over a very short period of about 18 to 20 years, major transformations across the continent. And I think it would be wrong not to acknowledge what was achieved in those periods. But what was achieved was to, whereas the movement for freedom was about gaining rights, gaining self-determination, what the vocabulary changed to in the post-independent period, that it was not about freedom, it was not about being able to determine one's own destiny, it was about this chronic, appalling word, development. That was the name of the game. And that enabled all the Oxfams, Boxfams, Soxfams of the world to fly in there with their parachutes and bag of tricks and dig wells, etc. What they did, and it became really serious in the subsequent period, was to in a sense participate in the process of removing all those gains of independence that we fought for and shed blood for. Because in the 80s, in the late 70s and 80s, we saw a major change on an international level. And I think it's really important to understand what was going on. We had the emergence of the structural adjustment programs in the late 70s, early 80s. And over the last 30 years, the consequence of those structural adjustment programs has been, one, to remove subsidy from healthcare, from social welfare, from education, even from subsidy to farmers, in case they were able to compete with those American and European farmers who are heavily subsidized. But worse still, they opened up our territories to the free movement of corporate capitalism, of the multinationals and the oligopolies. I want to make this phrase clear, this word clear, oligopolies. In the 70s and 80s, we maybe have been talking about transnational corporations, we may have been talking about multinational corporations. But today, across the world, there are maybe 500, to be generous 700, corporations which control every single aspect of our lives. Whether it's to do with the clothing you wear, the food you eat, the roads that you use, the trains that you might go on. I don't know if you use trains still in the United States. I think they were sold off to the Ford Corporation.
We use them sometimes.
But most crucially, was that our governments became supine servants of the oligopolies. That the international development agencies, the NGOs and so on, and the aid agencies basically used public funds to subsidize the exploitation of our continent, of our people and our resources under the guise of development, under the guise of so-called investment, in order to suck it down, it clean. For those of you who think that development and development funding has been of importance, let me give you some facts and figures on this. The UN issued a report 2 years ago in which they showed that over the last 50 years, the governments of the North, the so-called donor countries, have contributed $2 trillion in development aid. $2 trillion. I thought of that, goodness me, that's a lot of money. Okay, I couldn't put that in my trousers. In the last year alone, that same report said, $18 trillion of public funds was contributed to the finance houses, the banks, who all got us into this mess to begin with. That's the scale of the problem. One step further, they all claim that development funds increased in the period 2002 to 2007. Charles O'Brugere and his group, there's an article on Pambazuka News about this, analysed what exactly had happened in that 5-year period, 2002 to 2007. And what they found was that the total increase in aid was entirely accountable by the writing off of debt to Iraq, that occupied state, and the writing off of debt to Nigeria, that oil-producing state. If debt relief as debt payment is part of the equation of aid, they argued, using data from the IMF, they were able to say, all right, let's look at the net flow. There's aid going in one direction, and there is debt repayments coming in the other direction. They found that the net flow of aid was negative. It was from the south to the north. And they estimated that this was equivalent to $2,775 billion in favor of the north. Okay? So now you understand that aid and the whole system of aid is a highly profitable business. It is there to oil the machineries of an occupational force. But this is not a colonization. Let's be clear. There may be in Kenya more Wazungu today than there were at any time during the colonial period, but they are not colonizers. They are part of the machinery of occupation. We are living in occupied territories. The occupation is that of the handful of oligopolies who command our economies. They command our economies in such a way that even our governments are no longer accountable to us. They are accountable to the international financial institutions, and they are accountable to these oligopolies. That's the situation we face today. It is going even worse with the whole biotechnological revolution, where it is not just land grabbing that is going on. This is a massive, massive grab for the genetic resources of Africa. Because of the oil crisis, because the cost of oil is going up extremely high and likely to go much higher, the argument is, let's go for a so-called green economy. And so they are turning biomass, anything that grows in Africa, into, using the new technologies, exactly the same products, not only fuel, but clothing, plastic, you name it, that oil actually provides. This is not a colonization. This is a real occupation, a real attempt to solidify, thanks to the taxes that you pay, the exploitation of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much.